Interestingly enough, though, a headdress, a chief headdress, was recovered from the battlefield, and Captain Frohawk writes about it in his report. It's a big feathery chief headdress with over 20 silver medallions, and he sends this as a gift to then General Ulysses S. Grant.
So where is it today?
One thing that's really special about Fort Lancaster, apart from being the only U.S. Army fort here in Texas to be attacked by American Indians, is that when you're out here, you hear the same sounds that they probably would have heard over 160 years ago, and you see the same scenery that they would have seen back in the 1850s and early 1860s. Because of how remote this is, it's virtually undeveloped, and when visiting Fort Lancaster, you get a real sense of that.
Well, I see you've done a great job here on keeping the growth down. We got accounts of where this land, and even moving to Arizona, was this beautiful prairie of grassland.
Yes, yes, sir.
And then it got overdeveloped and overwatered and irrigation and everything else, and earthquakes. And
yes.
But this is, I just can't imagine how this would have looked. Even South Texas, where you are. Grassland.
Grassland,
beautiful.
yep.
That's why all the cattle were here.
Yeah, there still are some mesquite trees, for instance, out here. They wouldn't have been native during the time this was a fully fledged fort. But apart from that, I mean, it's incredibly similar to what they would have seen, if not exact. And not much has really changed besides that. And our fort itself is in ruins. As I mentioned earlier, the fort is in ruins for a whole array of reasons, but we'd like to keep the ruins this way because the ruins themselves sort of tell the story of the fort. These are original ruins to the 1850s, so these are pre-Civil War buildings that you're seeing here around us. And apart from that, I mean, the buildings have a testimony to tell about how they were burned, they fell into ruin, and these are the buildings that the soldiers lived in, and these are the buildings that the Buffalo soldiers would have used for cover during the Battle of Fort Lancaster. So I think that's really special. And if you look at our historical marker right here, it says the ruins of Fort Lancaster. And it's a real privilege to have our marker in such good shape as it is today. Nonetheless, I mean, Fort Lancaster itself is in the shape it's intended to be, I believe. One thing that really gives me chills often is to think about how these are the grounds that the men lived and worked on, and there wouldn't have been a path as well established as this, but apart from that, these are the buildings that the men were in, and I'll show you in a bit, but when I stand on the doorsteps of these officers' barracks or the enlisted men's barracks, it's incredible to think that these are the men that I've read and researched about, and you could very well imagine lived full lives after Fort Lancaster. They were here at this site, standing on those doorsteps. Who knows what they were reminiscing about? So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that really sticks with me is how this very doorstep I'm standing on, the officers would have probably stood here overlooking their men, reviewing them. We believe that this was kept in carpenter's quarters right here. We don't have 100% verifiable information on that, but in all likelihood it probably was. And another thing that's really interesting about this site are the buildings themselves. So the further east you are, you see buildings in East Texas or other forts there that are composed entirely out of limestone. If you head west to the American Southwest, you see a lot more forts that are made out of adobe entirely. But Fort Lancaster, it seems like we're entirely in a desert here, but in all actuality, we're actually in a transitionary zone between the Texas Hill Country and the Chihuahuan Desert. And that's reflected in our architecture here. The buildings themselves were a mixture of the limestone blocks you see here and adobe. So over time, because of the adobe's the way it erodes and such, all that's left is primarily the limestone, and I think that's another distinguishing factor about Fort Lancaster.
This is wonderful. Tell me about it.
So this itself is the barracks of Company K, 1st Infantry Regiment. There was barracks for Company H and Company K, and this is Company K's barracks. This is our tallest remaining structure here on site. So we have our chimney right here. This is original to the 1850s, and at this time, peak 1859, 1858, there would have been about 160 men garrisoned here at Fort Lancaster. Of, like I said, Companies H and K, the 1st Infantry Regiment. In 1859, Company H, which were in those other barracks down over there, they would vacate Fort Lancaster to go build and establish Fort Stockton. And Company K would remain here until the beginning of the American Civil War.
It's very interesting. I mean, the architecture is, you just wouldn't think a group of soldiers would come build something like this. With no guidance, no engineers here. Robert E. Lee wasn't here. None of those people were here.
No,
it's just it's in such good shape to be as old as it is. Now I know that when they vacated this fort, did the Indians burn it down?
They did. So we know that the U.S. Army was here at this fort until 1861. They vacated, and the state of Texas and the Confederate Texans maintained control of this fort until 1862. Afterwards, the fort was abandoned, and by the end of the Civil War, we know the fort was entirely burned by Native Americans.
Well, this is great. Look at the landscape out here. I don't know if the camera can get all this or not, but it is so nice.
Absolutely.
Flat. Was this flat when they came here, I guess?
This was all flat, and there is sort of a natural curvature to the fort itself. But the surrounding mesas and hills really add to the dramatic look of the fort.
Yeah. Okay, great.
All right, so this is the corral. This is where the peak of the battle would have occurred between the Company K, the 9th Cavalry, and the attackers who converged on the fort on December 26th of 1867. The primary objective of the attackers was to actually steal the horses of the Buffalo Soldiers. So when the Buffalo Soldiers were attacked out in this valley, they brought the horses in through the fort and tried to secure them here in the corral. Unbeknownst to them, though, the gate was raised by the attackers, and the Buffalo Soldiers were unable to get the horses into the corral. And because of the gunfire, the arrows flying in this vicinity, the horses of the Buffalo Soldiers stampeded out this way to the south. And Captain Frohawk, this may seem a major inconvenience or a major loss to have your horses stolen by your attackers, but Captain William T. Frohawk, the officer in charge, he writes in his report that had the stampede not happened, had the horses been able to be controlled into the corral, all probably would have been lost, because it would have been a small force of Buffalo Soldiers defending the corral from overwhelming odds. So in a way, the loss of the horses was a blessing in disguise for the Buffalo Soldiers and the men of Company K.
Now, where were the men set up mostly when they were fighting? Were they all around here, or they concentrated in this area?
They would have been in the buildings, certainly, and Captain Frohawk established with his lieutenant, they would have established a skirmish line to sort of ward off the attackers.
Okay. Now, how long did this battle last?
It was over a few hours.
Oh, okay.
So it was a few hours, but the major point of it, the sort of the highlight of it, was when the horses were brought in through the fort, and the peak of it was right here as they were trying to secure them. The Buffalo Soldiers were prodded for a while, for several hours after, but by nightfall, the battle had all but concluded.
Okay. And 3 people were killed?
3 people were killed. That would be Anderson Trimble, Eli Bowers, and William J. Sharp.
Now, whatever, did the Indians carry off their dead?
Their own. So, interestingly, the after-action report notes that roughly 20 attackers were killed. We believe that the attackers picked up their dead from the battlefield and took care of them. We're not sure if 20 is the correct number, but that is what is reported. Interestingly enough, though, a headdress, a chief headdress, was recovered from the battlefield, and Captain Frohawk writes about it in his report. It's a big feathery chief headdress with over 20 silver medallions, and he sends this as a gift to then General Ulysses S. Grant.
So where is it today?
We don't know. It's sort of lost to the pages of history, but Certainly, it might still be out there somewhere.
You know, some historian that knows about headdresses could probably say this was Kickapoo or this was, you know, whoever. But
perhaps, but I think that's a very neat connection that Fort Lancaster has to the famed general and eventual president Ulysses S. Grant.
Well, how about that? That's a good story. Is it? Maybe it's in the Capitol somewhere, stored in the basement.
Who knows?
Okay, well that was great. What else we gonna see?
So Fort Lancaster was established in 1855 to protect the San Antonio to San Diego Trail. And at this time, in this time period, people were heading west, outwards, to participate in the California Gold Rush, to participate in the westward expansion in this time period. And this necessitated Fort Lancaster to be established. You can kind of see the evolution of forts springing up all across Texas in this time period to protect travelers and settlements out east. What you see here, this beautiful map, this was done by the U.S. Army Survey Team in 1849, and you can see the region. Here is Fredericksburg, Texas for reference. Here is San Antonio, and right here you would see the Live Oak Creek. Now that's the water source that sustained Fort Lancaster. So I'll take you to our scale model of the fort, and Fort Lancaster was named after a gentleman named Mr. Job Roberts Hamilton Lancaster. He was West Point class of 1840, and he was ranked 7th in his class. Rank 6 was none other than William T. Sherman. So we have our scale model of the fort. This is what the fort would have looked like in its prime. This is probably roughly around 1859, 1858, and at its peak, there were 160 men here at Fort Lancaster. That's not including the women and children and other civilians that probably would have been present at this post. We have the barracks that would have belonged to companies H and K of the 1st U.S. Infantry Regiment. We have the officers' row, we have the hospital, and the San Antonio to San Diego Trail ran east to west. So in juxtaposition to this scale model, here is east on this side, here is west over here. So the trail would have ran across the most important buildings for civilian travelers. So we have the hospital right here. The road would have ran past that, would have ran past a sutler store. You can think of this as a supply stop or a general store. And then we have the blacksmith right here. This would have been sort of the mechanic back in the day. And they would have looped around the post and continued heading out west. So today, Fort Lancaster is in ruins for all sorts of reasons. The fort was only officially occupied by the U.S. Army between 1855 and 1861. The fort was abandoned, given to Confederate Texans at the onset of the Civil War. They abandoned it in 1962, and the fort was burned. Subsequently after that, the fort fell into ruins, and the Buffalo soldiers who fell under attack here, they were tasked with reestablishing this fort and reestablishing the U.S. government's presence in West Texas. So we have this camel right here. You're probably thinking, what is a camel doing here in West Texas? Why the heck is this here? Well, this is our Old Kate. This is our friend Old Kate. She's a camel. And with her, along with a few panels that we have, we tell the story of the U.S. Army camel experiment. You see, after the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, the United States government now had control over vast swaths of land in the American Southwest. And there was a prevailing belief that the American Southwest was a great vast desert. In some ways they were right, and because of that, the U.S. government imported camels from the Middle East and North Africa. They were brought on the ship, the USS Supply, and brought all the way from the Old World all the way to Indianola, Texas, where they were offloaded. They were taken to Camp Verde here in Texas, 60 miles west of San Antonio, and that was sort of where they were headquartered. And from there, they continued to mount expeditions westward, crossing through Fort Lancaster on 3 occasions. In 1857, 59, and 60. This room right here, we talk about the battle that occurred here in 1867. This would be a pretty special occasion because the 9th Cavalry had only been formed in 1866, and in a way they would get their baptism by fire in a major engagement here at Fort Lancaster. So we have this mock-up of what the barracks would have looked like, whitewashed adobe and limestone. And in here, we tell the story of this battle that happened here at Fort Lancaster. So Company K was sent out here to rehabilitate the post. They were actually headquartered out of Fort Stockton, but Fort Lancaster was a substation in this time. And Fort Lancaster had been a ruin since it had burned, it was neglected, it had fallen apart. And they arrived here in the summer of '67, and they were trying to rehabilitate the post. And in December 26th of 1867, the day after Christmas, they fell under attack. The 58 men of Company K were attacked by a reported 900 Native American warriors. There is a belief that it was the Kickapoo. We believe it was Kickapoo warriors. But there was also mentions in the first-hand accounts of white men in Confederate uniforms and Mexican renegades. So it's certainly interesting to entertain the idea that it was sort of a motley crew of sorts that attacked Fort Lancaster. Captain William T. Frohawk, he was the gentleman in charge. He was a veteran of the Civil War. So was his lieutenant, Fred Smith. Many of the African-American enlisted men of Company K were also veterans of the Civil War. So because of their experience and the fact that they had the Spencer repeating carbine, this helped turn the tide of the battle in their favor. The Spencer amplified their gunfire, the capability to return fire. They had the buildings as cover, and the battle-hardened veterans of Company K were able to withstand such a large attack by over 900 enemies. You would think that they'd be wiped out, but because of these factors, the Buffalo Soldiers prevailed in their first baptism by fire. The fort would be abandoned officially by 1879. It would fall into ruin, and the rest is history.